No, you're like, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And Rachel will be acting as our tech person and occasional moderator. And so with that, I guess I'll go with the first question. Carter, we just read a pretty impressive bio, and I'm wondering, how did you get here, especially with a history degree? How did you end up where you are?
Thank you. I want to thank Dartmouth for inviting me back. It's always great to be here. Carter, you didn't say class of 1990. So like one way, which is what I am. So, one way is that, I've been around for a while and, shifted and not let the grass grow under my feet, but it's great to be back. I was just saying and chatting with, Jess and Michelle beforehand that I don't think they had an environmental studies major, or I wasn't self-aware enough to actually develop my own. I think a few people did it on their own. So like everything else, the whole field has matured and we'll get into that. But I was, yes, utility infielder, metaphorically speaking, and a history major. And I did work in the environmental field between undergrad and law school for 2 years because that was my passion. I always knew I wanted to do it, and found my way into it various places, and then went to law school, knowing that's what I wanted to do, and was an environmental lawyer for more than a decade, about a dozen years, in various posts, and that was great. And then made a shift, and I think one thing that I think is interesting, and I'm happy to answer questions about specific roles, but I kind of made that shift on my own because I thought I'd have a bigger impact working on programs and policies. And there was an opportunity to do a lot of great work in New York City, where I lived then and live now. It was a wonderful experience to sort of reach out through programs and have some serious investments behind environmental ideas. So that's why I made those shifts. And I think if you're, open-ended, I think, one thing that's happened over the last few decades is that the environmental field has matured, formalized. And one thing you do see, and I teach in programs that the Columbia program is a master's in sustainability management. It's only 10 years old. It didn't really exist. And they have now, maybe 60 students a year go through that. So there's 600 to 1,000 grads now who are out there with this formalized degree. It didn't happen. So when I first came into sustainability, such as it was, I think New York City's was the first municipal sustainability plan, at least in the US, and at least a big one. And so, folks like me who I had a regulatory background that was useful for the team. Many people had, technical chops, engineering background, very common and useful and good. Other people were economists, planners. So it was kind of a, joint effort in that sense.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm curious, when you said that you did some environmental jobs between college and law school, what were they? Were they out in the field, trail crew?
I wish, the field is for the young, and it's really an incredible, background. I was a little bit of ski bum in college, one of my terms, which was great, and that certainly could have continued. No, I spent time as a paralegal, stuck in an office, and then I went to work for the Environmental Protection Agency, doing, kind of junior stuff. It was great. It was kind of a peek into a vast, federal bureaucracy. I think field work is incredible, and I would certainly urge that versus, desk work. I didn't often those go to folks who have biology or engineering or, some kind of technical background, in this wonderful work.
That's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, and I was curious a little bit about like why you ended up deciding to go to law school, because I know you said that you ended up, not transitioning away from being attorney later, and I was just wondering if you still feel like, your law background has been really crucial to you and like throughout your career.
I think it has. I mean, law is very useful. I was kind of used to it because I had lawyers in my family, but also a lot of the environmental heroes at the time had been lawyers, sort of crusaders who were fighting polluters and still are. That's great. It ultimately, wasn't where I wanted to stay. but that was kind of the hero ideal out there. There were a few other things I was considering. I mean, I think taking time off and not to go straight through, that's great. If you take time off, I think that's even better, honestly. You get some perspective. I was looking at things that were, in my mind, obscure then, but that was because of my background and what I was exposed to, like urban planning. It sounds hard to believe, but I was accepted at a few urban planning schools. I didn't really know that it was a field you could go into. And so I didn't know enough then to sort of take some of those things seriously, or some of the great, masters in environmental studies programs that are out there that in retrospect would have been a better fit. But you can get to a lot of places. I mean, one thing is, like, you're never stuck. I know all of you, and I'm still deciding what I want to do when I grow up, but you're never stuck, and can constantly sort of reinvent yourself, or I like to say evolve. And law school is a great background. I did have to put in my time at a big corporate firm, not doing environmental. I wasn't willing to do sort of environmental defense work. So I actually did antitrust work and did pro bono environmental work on the side to pay off my law school loans. So yeah, there's that trade-off always, but it's a good general background. And certainly, one thing you learn in law school is how to read very closely, laws, regulations, things of that nature. And you're familiar with the legislative process, how you actually translate goals into binding agreements. So that's I think an important skill for everyone. And I think they do teach a little bit of that in some of those other schools I mentioned as well.
Well, I really like your point about being able to transition, because I think, like, for me and for Michelle and other students who are like nervous about what's coming after we graduate, I think like it's nice knowing that that whatever we do, like right off the bat, doesn't necessarily have to be the end all be all.
Well, can I just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah.
Just, I mean, I will say, the field evolves, right? I mean, yes, like wind and solar have been around for a long time, right? But things like that, or on a more basic level like weatherization. But as these things have become more important, there's a whole field, and like there's a cottage industry, more than cottage industry in New York City, for example, around energy efficiency in buildings. And that's because in 2009, we passed a series of laws called the Greater Greener Buildings Law set, and it's actually 4 laws. And it was always the case the building owners should have had an incentive to save money and invest in energy saving measures. Some are more expensive than others. Some there's a longer payback than others. But this was formalized, and all of a sudden they had to, and they were graded, and it was more regulated. And so my point there, and now renewables are huge because of renewable fuel standards and other things. The field evolves, and all of as environmental stuff becomes mainstream is a bad, or sort of a simplistic shorthand for it. But as more and more people are aware of the importance of it, where you can go, shifts as well. So yes, I guess to a point, the field does change. Nothing in it's dynamic, and I think that's wonderful. So you have to be flexible.
Yeah, thank you for that. What I'm really curious to ask you is, when throughout your career have you felt that your work was most impactful, and why?
Yeah, I would say one of the things you mentioned was the New York Clean Heat Plan. And, we worked in New York City at a very local level. So I guess, the sort of one of the headlines is that, you can see your impact. It's not 10 years in the future, and it's right now. So just to back up a little bit, there's a 1972 a bunch of federal laws were passed, right? One of which was the Clean Air Act. And so that regulates major sources. And so things like refineries, and there's also certain federal standards for things like cars and things that, you don't want a patchwork of 50 state laws around cars. And you don't want like 14,000 municipal jurisdictions regulating cars, right? So a lot of big sources are dealt with at the federal level, and then medium sources to simplify at the state level. And then there's things that are not regulated and are left wide open. And often municipalities haven't stepped forward. And we just realized over time that there were certain very stubborn, pollutants in New York City that weren't going away. And we kind of got into the project, and it turned out that for historical reasons, New York City had been regulating air quality and really what you burn in buildings for hot water and heat. Even before the Federal Clean Air Act, they actually had to ban coal, which was, happening, soft coal in New York City in the 60s. There was a killer smog in New York City in the 60s that killed, I think around 50 or 60 people one year. You hear about London in the 40s, but it was happening in New York City in the 60s. So there was this tradition of local regulation that had we needed to revive. It kind of gone dormant after all the action and actions were happening at the federal level. So we discovered these old tools. We discovered a local problem that wasn't being addressed, and that was the burning of what's called residual heating oil. This is heating oil that's residual, meaning it's at the bottom of the barrel, literally, and you have to heat it because it's solid at room temperature, right? So it's, just one step removed from coal, which remains solid at room temperature when you heat it a little bit until it burns. So, and this is what's also called bunker fuel, but there are basically two places in the US where it was burned. Ships, big ships, and those emissions are at sea, and you don't really worry about it until it's coming into port. And New York City. And that's because we had all these big buildings that were geared up to do it in, pre-war buildings. And they were big enough they could have a boiler, and, it was sort of had stepped in as the cleaner alternative in the 60s to coal. So we were stuck with this old fuel no one else was using, and New York City was literally dumping ground for this. And we kind of knew that was the case. And this is where it sort of, again, just to your point, like, why was it satisfying? Because all these pieces came together. It's like a perfect policy storm. So we had these tools that we had that hadn't been used, but we dusted them off or de-rusted them, or whatever you want to say. We had a local problem, and we confirmed the local problem using some pretty cool science. So we stood up something called the New York City Community Air Survey. And these were, again, I described sort of the difference between federal, state, and local, right? And to sort of monitor those, there's monitors at a very large scale. So for example, the federal and state clean air program, there's 5 monitors in New York City, and they're at rooftop. And we're like, you're missing a lot of pollutants because you're not at ground level. The resolution's not great. So we stood up this system that was pretty cool with some local universities and other in our Department of Health to monitor it at street level. And we did a regression analysis after monitoring, I think it was 200 sites for a number of seasons. And we had this great data set that was new. We did a regression analysis, and it turned out, yes, the bunker fuel burned in these big buildings was the problem. So we had a very targeted way to, solve a local health problem. And so, long story short, we banned the certain, we phased out, but we ultimately banned the dirtiest fuel. We created a middle fuel. We created a clean fuel system at the state level and also at the city level, and we rolled it out. And what was often you see the impact in many years, right? And this is, I think, a challenge for climate change. It's like such a big challenge, and if you make an impact, will you see it in your lifetime? It's unclear. This one we saw almost immediately. And so because we had that monitoring network that we kept, we could see that, in fact, air was much cleaner overnight. It's like what happened in Beijing with the Olympics, or frankly, what's happened with air emissions with under COVID, when, the airline industry kind of hit the wall. Like very dramatic impact. And so it's very satisfying.
Well, thank you. That was awesome. I wonder then, Carter, Dartmouth currently burns about 3.5 million gallons of number 6 fuel oil every year. I don't know if you have a
protest. That should not happen. Come on, people.
I know, maybe you can lead an initiative on behalf of our 90s alums saying, please stop.
That is really shameful, actually. That's terrible. So I guess that's one of the other few places they burn it. Actually, I mean, New England has a problem with heating oil in general, partly topography and just, land use patterns and the like. But it's one reason why and this might get me in trouble in this crowd, but I have very mixed feelings about some of the gas pipelines that were planned across New York and killed going across New York to bring natural gas to New England because it would have displaced heating oil. With natural gas, yes, it's another fossil fuel, but it's much cleaner. So
It's also interesting. I'm not sure like how well you've been keeping up with sort of Dartmouth like energy, but a couple years ago there was a proposal to put in place a biomass plant to replace the heating oil. And then there was actually pushback against that, both from community members and also from like some other alums who felt that that was not the greatest solution because of the combustion aspect of it and the short-term aspect, like combustion and releasing of carbon into the atmosphere. And so that actually has been put on pause. And I was just like, I wasn't, I didn't mean to ask you this before, but if you do have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them about Dartmouth's like current situation.
Well, I mean, look, you got to run the numbers, and that's why it's great you two have engineering backgrounds, right? Like what's good, what are the emissions, from the pipe in the pipe? Can you control it, and how expensive is it going to be, right? And often that's, we can do that through, source material that's cleaner, which is, what we've been talking about, the fuel switch, the combustion process, or, the filters or other measures at the end. Typically anything at the end is more expensive, right? But I'd be curious on the biomass. What I am not up to speed on that debate. Just so some general questions. Definitely, you have to look at the source. Like when we in New York City were looking at biodiesel, for example, we had to thread a needle in that. If we mandated like the municipal fleet was going to have a certain level of biodiesel, there's technical feasibility. Could you burn it? Would it work? And like sanitation trucks in the middle of the winter that have to plow. Maybe not at 20% or 25, maybe at 10%. Then the question quickly became, are we just facilitating like palm oil? It's a long supply chain. Or is it just like palm oil conversions in Indonesia that are destroying like orangutan habitat and, peat bogs? And that's terrible. What we ultimately ended up doing was pegging our biodiesel mandate to the level that we thought could be met by recycling used restaurant grease. And so there is like some cleaner sources, and then we did certain things to encourage that. So fast forward to Dartmouth, or hopping over to Dartmouth situation, like, are there locally sourced cleaner methods? I would, I don't know what the biosource material was, if it was going to be sort of agricultural waste or, things like that. I think that's interesting. One thing that is certainly widespread in places like Germany that I've long thought should be more looked at more commonly in the States as basically biogas, anaerobic digestion. It happens. There's sort of, I ran a New York City Department of Environmental Protection. It's really kind of a bad name for that agency. It's New York City's water department and wastewater department. And on the wastewater side, we, you get solid sludge from the wastewater process. You know what that means. And it was digested anaerobically, and it produced biogas. And some of that's used directly. It's an old technology. And some of that we actually started to clean up and pump into the grid for use by residential areas. And there's certainly, I know, it's a very scalable technology. And so, very small plants are using it. There's farm scale anaerobic digesters. And I would think that given all the, food waste and other things that are happening at Dartmouth, that was something that they could look at as well. You're processing without combusting, organic waste, right? And you're doing it in a way that produces methane that you can burn and use for heating and lighting and things like that.
Yeah.
So I hope they get a better solution than number 6 heating oil, which is the word. They should at least switch tomorrow to ultra low sulfur diesel number 2. So one thing we had to do is use number 2 oil. It flows, it's cleaner. Some of it can have high sulfur. So we worked in that policy I mentioned to basically have the heating oil sulfur standard be the same as number 2 is basically like diesel that you use in trucks. They dye it red because it has higher sulfur. But if you use like truck diesel, it's a little bit more expensive. It's much cleaner. And they could do that. They could, without a lot of changing of the physical plant, they could change it pretty immediately. There's an economic case to be made, I'm sure, and public health case to be made.
Well, that's awesome. Wow. Yeah, thanks, Carter. We'll write down that diesel and send it off to Hamlin right now. I think just to, I guess, get back on our original line of questioning, we are super curious about your long and storied career, and in particular, your work in the Bloomberg administration, or just in generally in the municipality level. So can you comment on the influence of politics in your work? Specifically, I'm intrigued by your involvement in disaster relief policies and how politics / the election cycles have influenced them, if at all.
Wow. Yeah, I'm trying to unpack your question. I mean, it's a great one. There's a lot there. I will say that like the municipal sector in general has sort of gotten renewed attention because cities, like for example, under Paris, right, that there's C40, which is a misnomer because it's like 95 cities or whatever as part of C40s, but cities actually kind of rediscovered the powers that they had to change municipal fleets, regulate building emissions, obviously change public transport and other things, and have a significant impact on our carbon profile. And it's 80%, 85%, I think now of Americans live in cities or municipalities. That's a pretty generous definition of what's an urban area. It's just a census, density definition. But cities they're not recognized in our governmental system, in our federal system, but they have a lot of power on their own. And so I think that was kind of a realization in something I hope you all, take a look at, because it's very satisfying too, because you're close to the action. Again, like you put in place, a composting program in your solid waste, and you can see the results right there. And you can really feel like, wow, I'm having an impact. I kind of lost the thread of your question, Michelle, but sorry.
No worries. It was just, how has, if at all, the influence of politics affected
politics? Yeah. So, I mean, look, that's the other thing. I think you got to make sure that there's commitments at the candidate stage for environmental programs and then carry through. I think it's probably easier. A lot of cities tend to be more liberal and sort of more open to sort of progressive ideas, and so it's kind of easier to get those, or they're more willing to look at environmental commitments perhaps than at the state or even federal level. Politics has a big change. I mean, a change of administration can be strong. I think I joined Mike Bloomberg's administration in his second of 3 terms. And I think it really was in his second term that the environment became an issue. The first term, just a bit of history, was like right after 9/11, right? So the focus was on rebuilding New York, was on things other than the environment, basically. And it was only until, those crises passed that he could turn to the environment. I think he was, because he was an independently wealthy businessman who hadn't come up through politics, he was willing to sort of take, be a pragmatic problem solver, and also sort of think about cost benefit, and follow the numbers in a way. And so that was all very useful to crafting good policies that would move the needle.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Yeah, so that was really interesting, and I've really enjoyed like hearing your work at the city level. But I also wanted to touch on sort of the work you're doing now, which is at the Trust for Public Land, and if you want to talk about anything related to that, go ahead. But the question that I was really curious about, especially, was well, I was looking at the Trust for Public Land, and I know that one of their values is that they value equity and access to the outdoors for all.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about like how equity comes into play in the work that you do, and like really when working on any sustainability issue, how has like equity and justice come like been considered, I guess, in any of the work that you do?
Yeah, great question. It's so important. I mean, I would say just to, and I'll leave it behind quickly because we spent a lot of time on it, but on some of the city policy level, you know, a lot of that is trying to rectify um, uh, problems with, you know, pollution and environmental justice neighborhoods, you know, measured by, you know, low income, minority, poor social, you know, something called the social vulnerability index that we used. And we've modified that in many cities to include the impacts of urban heat island, which heat is a big killer from climate change. And so there's something called the heat vulnerability index that you could check out. Yeah, I mean, in our current role, I mean, Trust for Public Land is a national nonprofit, been around since 1972. We've done work all over the country, including in Hanover. We did a project where I forget the name of the farm, but we protected a buffer area around the Appalachian Trail, which is great. But so I work in New York City, and you know, we do land conservation as well, but we also do park creation. And you know, from the get-go, one thing that attracted me to Trust for Public Land was our mission has always been land for people, and it had a strong people focus. So from kind of some of the funky city work we did in the 70s and 80s around community gardens and super grassroots work to what we currently do, which is you know, park and playground construction. You know, equity figures very large. We've always kind of worked to enable communities and empower communities, and that's often in high need neighborhoods, which, you know, we look at health and, you know, income and other social characteristics to sort of figure out where park is needed most. We do use some analytics. So, you know, analytics bring to bear. You can go, for example, to parkserve.org and see a big data set where every urban area in the country, by the census definition, so there's 14,000 or so, we mapped, you know, who has a park within a 10-minute walk and who doesn't. And so you can plug in your hometown or a place you're curious about and see where there are high park need areas, park deserts, where the optimal place is to place parks. And it's a tool for cities and communities, really, to build it. So, you know, we do, I guess equity is like, where should we focus public resources? And also, who do we help? I mean, you know, and how do we operate? Because we often want to come in, we like parks, we promote them, we think they're sort of multi-purpose infrastructure and should be considered seriously as infrastructure because of various benefits, climate, environmental, educational, certainly health and wellness, and social. You know, it's like where we all meet and where we mix. You know, it's in New York City, it's like the subway cars, but no one rides subways anymore. Like streets and parks, and that's what's happening now. And that's kind of always been the case. So for a strong society where we care about each other, you got to have public places. But just to return back to sort of how we operate, you know, it's really critical. Even though you come in with some tools that are sort of highly refined and technical, you know, in a point of view, certainly that parks are good for everyone. Everybody should have them. We also want to sort of realize community aspirations and enable that. And so we're very committed to what we call participatory design, for example. So we work very closely with communities to sort of realize what they want. And, you know, often it's a park, not always a park, you know, and we'll help them. We do rail trail projects as well and other things. On the conservation side, you know, one thing that we're, you know, starting to get active in, I think there's a lot of room here left to go, is to sort of diversify what we call the user base, you know, folks who actually feel comfortable going to parks and identifying why it is that you know, a lot of non-white folks and low-income folks aren't comfortable in the woods, and we think that's you know, something we want to sort of understand and help address. And that's something, you know, again, another thing we're working on.
I'm curious, what answers has your team come up with yet? Just even if they're works in progress.
Well, I mean, probably the best example on the conservation side of a program that's really doing, you know, quite a bit, I would say, on the equity front, and, you know, working with indigenous peoples, and that's the way we started this whole meeting, is something that the land trust community is just grappling with now. We have a program in Hawaii, and that's one where, you know, there was a strong indigenous government structure until the 1880s, when we took it over at the behest of the Dole plantation and, you know, other folks, you know, but that tradition and ties to the land is still very strong. And actually, like, our land protection program there really is, you know, you could almost call it decolonization. You know, it's very, because a lot of the work we do is to protect those, you know, sacred sites. Yeah, you know, I forgot, I lost the thread of your question, Michelle, but I mean, I think that, you know, the work we do, you know, in cities, is, you know, is important, is bringing that sort of controlling those, or helping people realize that all the resources that can go into park systems, you know, should be benefiting all people.
Yeah, that's awesome. My last question, and then Jess will finish us off. But my last question, I guess, is, in your experience working in both the public and it seems like private sector, or definitely private sector also, how does the approach in addressing like concepts like decolonization, redlining, addressing the inequities of redlining, and other, you know, some like more out there terms that we're just like starting to embrace, like in the mainstream, if we are, how do your approaches differ working in those two different industries, essentially? Like, is it explicitly acknowledged in the public sector? I'm so curious.
Is it acknowledged in the public sector? You know, great question. To varying degrees, it's hard to generalize. I will say I did want to pick up on, you know, this is what I meant to say to your prior question, but I think it does relate to sort of redlining, is being aware that some of unintended consequences. So, for example, one of the big issues, and it's not applicable everywhere, but is, you know, do the public spaces we create displace people? You know, sometimes it's called gentrification. I think, you know, we like to think of a more precise term, perhaps being displacement. You know, one of the famous examples is not one of our projects, but the High Line in New York City, right? It just caused all this development because everybody wants to live near it. Another example that is one of our projects is something called the Bloomingdale Trail, or the 606 in Chicago, right? And so, you know, do you create public places that make it safe to sort of, or spur a bunch of economic development that doesn't accrue to everyone? And there's some solutions to that. So I think we're at the point now where we're acknowledging that, trying to anticipate it, mitigate it when we do a project, because we don't want the lesson to be that, well, we're not going to build parks in poor areas, because that would be terrible too, right? So there's various strategies. One is probably the best example for sort of dealing with those kind of equity issues in park creation and possible displacement is in DC and Anacostia. Not one of our projects, but something we follow very closely. It's called the 11th Street Bridge Project. And there's a program. What they did there was they made sure that there was, assembled a lot of money. And, you know, essentially not just to build a park, but also to invest in the community and to facilitate home ownership. And, you know, and so that when there was with some economic, when the park is built and there is economic development or community development, that the residents who were there before can have some ownership stake. So that's an example of how you can deal with those kind of things.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I know Michelle and I are like brimming with questions, but we do want to give everyone a chance to submit questions into the Q&A. So those of you in the audience, feel free to send questions now into the Q&A or chat functions. And in the meantime, something that we've been asking all of the speakers who've been coming for the Changemakers event is the question, what is something that's been sustaining you right now or recently?
Yeah, I mean, recently it's hard not to think about the COVID period and all the changes to, who we can see or who can't see, basically. And, not working in an office, but working from home and everything like that. So what's been sustaining me is, it's probably no surprise, is being able to get outdoors and, really connect with friends and family outside on walks and, in the woods. So that's, I think, what's keeping me sane and sustaining me.
That's awesome. All right, attendees, feel free to drop your questions. Otherwise, we can keep asking them. But well, Carter, just out of curiosity, what were you involved in at Dartmouth back in the 90s? What were you involved in at Dartmouth back in the 90s?
Well, so what was I involved with? Sadly, I mean, I have some regrets about that because I didn't do enough outdoor stuff I wasn't involved with the outdoors club in a formal way. I was a user, used a lot of those cabins, went to the second college grant a few times in Moose Lock, but not as much as I would like to now. So I played rugby. That was my thing. I played football for a year and then rugby. So that was kind of what my friend group did. And then we, yeah. And, as I said, one semester I was in Spain for language study abroad, which is great. I don't know if they still have that program in Granada, but it was wonderful. And then I spent a semester, one of my off semesters, in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, skiing. So that was a lot of fun.
Awesome.
So we do have a question that was sent to us by Abigail. She says, thank you for speaking with us. You touched on this a little, but can you talk more about how you blend the use of quantitative data for equity with other qualitative/community engagement methods for ensuring impact?
Yeah, I mean, it's, what I would say is I'm just going to leave the question up here a little bit so I, remember to circle back to it. I mean, we use both, and the quantitative data, I guess, is more, easily to mention. We use, we're pretty, not just well-versed, but we're at the cutting edge of, a lot of Esri ArcGIS work and so that is a suite we use and have really helped work with that company to, push what can be done in terms of, using demographic data through that set to not only sort of find out where the high need areas are in those areas without parks, but also there's something called business analyst suite there where we can, figure out all sorts of, other data about what the impact of something might be. But to get to your sort of qualitative portion of what you're saying, it doesn't do any good if that's not answering questions that people are asking. So we just spend a lot of time on the ground in community meetings, listening and then, supporting with information. Sometimes it's, other tools. Certainly we kind of, are good at raising money, and that's something we do, a lot of. We do a lot of public ballot measures. I forgot to mention, so as an aside, we've raised over $80 billion in public, state, and public ballot measures. So state and local measures where voters will approve environmental measures. So yeah, I think it's just being paying attention to that. I mean, we'll say that one of the challenges that we've had to face and sort of think about, and we're trying a lot of different things, is how do you engage the public during the period, during COVID, when we used to do a lot of in-person meetings for example, and certain things can happen online, but we're very aware. And I guess this gets back to the awareness of digital divide. We'll work, for example, we do a lot of participatory design with public schools in New York City, and that, the population, not only are they stressed and, not doing particularly great in terms of remote learning, but often, and there have been some measures to sort of bridge the technology divide anyways, but it's still there. And so we try to do as many in-person things as we can. So, we'll meet outside, spaced out, socially distant, I should say, so that we, can have maybe a public meeting with fewer attendees in an outdoor location, or, we're experimenting with like physical activity books that people actually can get. We're handing these out in Buffalo, for example, where we're doing a master park plan at libraries and at schools that are handing out meals to folks. They can fill out an activity book, and that helps us. That's kind of supplementing an online survey we have. We got great results, but they're skewing, they're skewing to white and wealthier respondents, which, we don't think is representative. So I guess to answer your question, it's like making sure that the qualitative side comes to, talking to folks, but also being aware of the limitations of the quantitative side. There's a chat question. Hold on. Urban and rural, challenges and opportunities, each type of setting. Are they all that different? I mean, there's certainly commonalities, I would say. This is really related to my current work creating public spaces. I mean, there are some differences that are maybe obvious, like we talk and use a metric called the 10-minute walk score, right? And that's presumes a walkable type neighborhood, or the ideal of one. That's not going to be the case in the Upper Valley of Connecticut, right? So, like a 30-minute drive analysis would be probably better there. But the same sensibility of trying to create a common space. One of the things that we do is, we call it kind of park creation in the woods almost, is Ascutney Mountain, right? It's right down the road. It was an old ski area, probably because of climate change. They couldn't keep up, right? Because, they had to make a lot of snow. And it really hammered that community of West Windsor, Vermont. And so we went in, we helped them rescue it, and we used some federal funds and put together a program. So now you can go, and it's what we call a community forest, but it's that old ski area is a commons. It's managed by something called Ascutney Outdoors. And, the benefits of that flow to the town. They've been able to sort of revive, their outdoor recreation based economy. And it's a cool spot to go, because you can, especially if you backcountry ski, it's an easy place to go to. They have put in a rope tow for kids that, they rescued some old equipment on the lower slopes, but the upper slopes, because they can't afford it, it's kind of back to the origins of skiing in the 30s, which I think is beautiful. And, it's a low cost way for people to go up, ski down. And, it's a great resource. So go check it out.
Well, Carter, I have a question maybe that you can touch on with your expertise in city planning. How much thought goes into a median and the size of a median? I don't know if you even know the answer.
I don't, and I wish I was a trained planner. I got planner jealousy. That would have been a path not taken that I wish I had. I have a lot of respect for urban planning, and I think I will say I sort of came to it sort of accidentally, and sort of trained on the job as it was. I'm a kind of quasi planning role now. The street space is really interesting. I mean, I'm going to answer a different question, Michelle, but hopefully it's related in your view. But like when you look at a city, in a place like New York City, you realize like how much space we devote to cars, right? It's like somewhere between, the public right of way includes sidewalks. And so if you include the streets and sidewalks, it's like a third of the city land area. And a lot of it's devoted to just storing cars. And people are just, these things kind of accrete over time, and you don't really think about it. They kind of just happen. And people have been sort of calling that out recently, and with really good results. So you're seeing sort of a reclamation of that scarce resource land. And so like a median would be one of those, for example. Whether, that's a lot of that's for traffic safety or beautification. It wouldn't surprise me though, like I'm trying to think of the great, any useful role it might play, complete streets approach. One might be, you might not call it a median, but it might effectively be a median, which is, the physical barrier for a dedicated bike lane, so that it's truly safe, right? Like the sort of highly effective but sort of low rent Jersey barriers, right? Those movable concrete barriers. If you have those, then people feel a lot safer biking, and it can be more mainstream. The more people can do it. I mean, we talked about technological change, and one that I think is really exciting, I haven't worked on, but we kind of deal with the consequences, is micromobility. And, that means like electric scooters, just scooters in general, electric scooters, all kinds of, bike shares, scooter shares, and the like, sort of, even electric bikes, are opening up and allowing folks to think of it as a viable alternative for commuting and transportation. And we're trying to get ahead of that with some, one of the projects that you kind of touched on in my bio, but it's ongoing right now, is a place like Long Island, like a typical post-war suburb. Like we're literally going through Levittown, which if you don't know is like the sort of cookie cutter stamp place. It's almost a shorthand for that kind of suburbia, very car dependent, right? And we're putting a bike path like directly through that, and to get ahead of some of these changes. And I think folks realize that you want those walkable, bikeable communities. That's what young folks want. That's what, to retain talent and to drive economic growth. It's really important.
I have a question actually, which is about how you mentioned, like, in an alternative world, maybe you would have considered urban planning. And I'm just curious if you have any advice for students who are considering grad school and are interested in sustainability, but like are kind of unsure what to study. Also sort of speaking for myself, because I think I'm kind of in that boat.
Yeah, I mean, I think sustainability, I would really kind of grill the schools about where they're placing people, and ask for the backup and the facts, and just make sure. But it strikes me, and I just see people come through our sustainability programs, again, like I said, they're pretty new. Or I also teach at NYU Wagner School of Public Policy. Like an MPA is also is a more established degree, I would say. And also, though, I would say both of those are kind of like law, utility degrees. You just get to do it in 2 years instead of 3, which is not insignificant thing to think about. And often, like Wagner, my students are all night students, so they work during the day. So yeah, there's a lot of great options. Like I say, you're not really locked into that. I would say, the 3, law, you can do a lot of things with that. I think, increasingly though, I will say law schools really have to get, often there's combined degrees, but lawyers aren't necessarily going to graduate with technical chops, and increasingly need stuff like that. Urban planning, is great. Sustainability, environmental studies programs at great places like Montana State or Michigan, or there's a lot of great environmental schools. Berkeley's got a great one. Yale School of Forestry, which I didn't even hear of. But now working in New York City, environmental world, I bump into Yale School of Forestry grads all the time. And who knew? I didn't know back in the day, but I wish I had. That would have been cool. So.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. I guess I'll follow up with a question. Just we have a few more minutes, so also this is to everyone. Feel free to drop another question into the chat. But I guess you mentioned, well, you certainly mentioned various third spaces.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's the right language to use for the
Yep.
park and whatnot. And I have been really curious in practice. Like I've really only heard of the park and the library as a third space that we can control, or a
Yep.
barber shop, I guess. But in the public or in your work, what are third spaces that you've created, or what that you found?
Yeah, and are you familiar with? I just got to put in a plug for this book because I think it's an easy read, and I think good is Eric Kleinenberg's Palaces for the People. Yeah, he's a professor at NYU. He wrote it a year or two ago. Palaces for the People, and you know his point of departure. You're right, Michelle. Is like those are the two common ones. Was that's what Andrew Carnegie I think called the libraries, right? So he, you know, robber baron, you know, distributed his wealth, one of the first like originals, and he created, I think it's like 3,000 Carnegie libraries across the country. You know, talked about a huge scalable philanthropic program, and he called it Palaces for the People, and they were meant to be sort of inspirational, not just you know, what all too often libraries are, which is just a place to store books, and you know, they're not glamorous, but it was meant to be inspirational. And so that's the third place. I mean, I haven't been involved in that, but I've been involved in mostly like parks and trails and things in my current job. I can't say, I mean, when I was at New York City, one of the things we did was, you know, I was working more on the sort of utility infrastructure side on water and wastewater. They're not really publicly accessible spaces, except that we have, you know, like a huge watershed in the Catskills that, you know, 100 to miles away from New York City, where that's the watershed for the water for the city. And we worked, and one of my roles was to come in as a non-expert. And I guess this is maybe a common theme too. You know, one thing a generalist can do is come in and ask a lot of questions, especially if you're not afraid of asking stupid questions, which you never should be. Ask questions and challenge long-going assumptions, right? And often in cross silos. And so, you know, opening up essentially sort of water engineers to the concept that it might be safer if there's more people actually walking around your watershed land, and you know, they're not going to dump a bunch of biological weapons in it. You know, they just physically you can't do that when a reservoir has 146 billion gallons. So it's like safer to have people around with eyes on the street kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I'm not really answering your third spaces question because I mean, opening up, you know, to the public some of that key infrastructure. I don't know if it'll ever become like a dedicated third space, but it's kind of a unique, kind of like highly curated third space. And I always think sort of having more public access. And I think frankly, it's a shame to sort of what's happened in January 6th at the Capitol, or what like post 9/11, where kind of understandably you've tightened down on security. But I, you know, hope we can come to a place where we can relax that a bit so the public sees more of the workings of the world and our cities and our country, and you know, things that are really cool because you know, if you have you know, if you emphasize security too much, you can really sort of shut down democracy. Not to be too grandiose, but I kind of think that's kind of what it comes to.
Yeah, no, that's perfect for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Carter. We're over time actually, so I do want to wrap up here. But I wanted to say thank you so much for, you know, coming and spending this time with us and imparting us with all of your wisdom. And it was really awesome to hear about I guess the diversity of different like projects and experiences that you've worked on throughout your career. And also thank you to everyone who came and for listening. Thanks for coming. And thank you to the Dartmouth Sustainability Office for sponsoring this event. Michelle, I don't know if you want to say anything.
No, and yeah, thanks to everyone, and thank you, Carter, for.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It was good. Enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.